There is a movement to unify, mostly at this point located within the sort of liberal academic elite scattered throughout the 30 confederated states. So they're progressives and they're liberals, and they want stuff like a parliament and representative democracy. And of course, that's going to be very unappealing to the Prussians or the Austrians. So who wants to stoop in the gutter to pick up that crown? So they can't find someone to really spearhead this unification. And yet, it is going to happen. And there is an important background to understanding German unification, because it happens in the context of the Franco-Prussian War, which is really a war between Germany and France that takes place in 1870. We need to understand that Prussia is getting to be very powerful at this point. They've outstripped France in steel production, industrial production, railways, agricultural output. They're just on the rise. And France is simply not able to compete with them. So Prussia is feeling that this would be a wonderful opportunity to use our superior strength and finally put France in her place. France, remember, had been the dominant power in Europe. And really, when people designed strategies for the balance of power, the state that they really have to keep in mind and to keep in check is France. So now, the reality is, Germany's more powerful than France, but there hasn't been an assertion of this new political and economic fact yet. And a war with France would be a way of making that perfectly clear. So Bismarck, the prime minister of this Russian state, wants a war with France and manages to get a war with France through the infamous Eames Dispatch. So the Eames Dispatch is basically a telegram that Bismarck sent on behalf of his king, the King of Prussia, King Wilhelm I, to Napoleon, that managed to be so infuriating that the French had no choice but to go to war. I say that lightly, of course they had a choice, but in their sense of national pride and national honor, they felt that they had no choice. So, backstory, this is a war ostensibly about Spanish succession. The Spanish throne had been offered to a relative of the German prince, Wilhelm I, a Hohenzollern, okay? And the problem, of course, for France is they are already dealing with this sort of surgingly powerful Germany on their eastern border. Do they really want to deal now with Germans on their southern border? They think not. So Napoleon III makes it very clear that should the Germans not absolutely discourage this move on the part of the Spanish, that he will go to war. And the truth is, the Prince Wilhelm actually agrees not to encourage the Hohenzollern claim to the throne. So that's not enough for Napoleon, because remember, there's an awful lot of grandstanding that is going on, because even as Germany wants to flex her might because she feels that she's becoming more powerful, France, that feels she's losing power, has even more reasons to want to demonstrate her power and her might. So Napoleon turns around and makes a very sort of importunate demand that Prince Wilhelm, in perpetuity deny any claim ever to the Spanish crown for any German prince. So now that is an extreme concession to require, and Wilhelm didn't go for it. Instead, when he's approached by the French ambassador, he refuses him and sends the French ambassador packing. But he does it in sort of a nice, polite, diplomatic sort of way. I mean, he doesn't really want, war. It's Bismarck, the strategist. He's the one that wants war. So Bismarck gets this telegram from the prince explaining what just happened, and he reframes it in a way to make it seem like the King of Prussia looks all proud and mighty and impertinent and just shuts him down. So like France is looking like it got schooled by Germany. So Bismarck now takes this adaptation of the original telegram, sends it off to France. Of course, it enrages Napoleon. The French press gets a hold of it, and that's when you get all those French people in the streets demanding that national honor be satisfied. And what they got was the Germans shelling Paris in a siege that, you know, left the city starving and humiliated and broken. You know, within weeks the Germans were there, because the fact and the truth of the matter is they had a more efficient military, they had a better transport and supply system, and boom, there they are in Paris. And the French are forced to sign a humiliating treaty. First of all, Napoleon III is captured and he resigns, and that's it for the Second Empire. Now we have the Third Republic. And to make matters worse, Germany actually demands Alsace-Lorraine, which is that eastern province. You can see it right here. Now, historically, it had swapped hands a couple of times, but in terms of the modern political framework, this was considered French territory, and this was egregious that Germany would try to take Alsace-Lorraine from the French. So imagine the degree of French humiliation and the dear, dear, desperate loathing for the Germans that they were nursing now. And in fact, it made their other dear, desperate loathing for the English pale by comparison. So now we've got mutual enmity, because don't forget, I mean, as far as the Germans were concerned, Napoleon had marched into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire and just occupied it and, you know, busted the place up. So now you've got a real continental face-off. And where's England in all of this? Where's England? Expanding her empire overseas and doesn't want to be bothered. Leave me out of it is the English attitude. So now what's happening to the traditional balance of power? England's not going to play her part, and France and Germany seem to be sparring off in a kind of hostility that really can't be contained or stabilized within a treaty system, as we're going to see. So Prince Wilhelm I gets crowned Kaiser Wilhelm I of the new German Empire, because in the wake of this Prussian victory, there was such a fervor, such a sense of pan-German celebration and joy, and also a sense that war brings, which is, you know, we have to band together with, you know, our brethren and defend each other. This was exactly the patriotic fervor of, you know, pan-Germanic patriotic sentiment that Bismarck was hoping to create. But in 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I dies. There's some other ruler, I think Frederick William, somebody there for 99 days. And then Kaiser Wilhelm II comes to power. And of all the figures, he's the one that people like to pin World War I on the most. And to a certain extent, with good reason, although there are a lot of other factors. First of all, he's grandiose, and he is a sort of posturing and constantly dressing in military garb, and he has these sort of expansionist dreams. Remember, he's the one that, you know, standing at the regatta and announcing that Germany needs her place in the sun, and he loves science and technology and wants to pick up the pace of modernization, and he wants Germany to take her place amongst the truly great empires of the world. In order to be a truly great empire, first of all, you need colonies. Germany didn't really have any. And second of all, you really need a navy, which Bismarck told him you cannot have. Because if you get a navy, you're going to make England mad. And if you make England mad, they're going to come and bust up your sweet, sweet continental situation that you've created for yourself, where Germany is the most dominant power. So he kicks Bismarck out in 1890, and now he's basically unchaperoned, and this more impulsive, visionary side of him begins to take over. In 1896, he goes to the Jubilee, the Fleet Review of Queen Victoria, and famously You know, he sees her fleet and basically wants one himself. And because he's an emperor of a highly industrialized, advanced nation or empire, he is going to get one. So he begins really the arms race. I've shown you this photograph before, but it's a great example. We have the HMS Dreadnought. It's a 1906 gunboat. This is actually British, but Germany turned around and got herself, you know, her own dreadnoughts. So this is 18,000 tons. It's 520 feet long, 82 feet wide. It's got a machine gun range that it's 20 miles, so that you can basically park this offshore and just, you know, wipe out whatever port you want without ever having to go on land. And you know, its armor has a thickness of a foot. So basically, you can take a lot of punishment. And one of the important things is that this sort of military apparatus and this kind of power was being developed in, you know, an imperial context. So, you know, Europeans were used to using this equipment on, you know, defenseless pre-industrial societies, and it was very unilateral, these contests, and, you know, they were over before they had even started. And in terms of Europe, these were for display purposes only. It was a big show. Europe never imagined that these great guns would be turned on them, and that they themselves would be pinned under a rain of mortar fire that they could not get out from under for 4 years. They didn't know that when you use it on each other, that when two industrial nations go at it with everything they have, that war actually doesn't end. Kaiser Wilhelm wanted all of these things. He wanted his place in the sun. He wanted his navy. He wanted this as expansion. And at the same time, there is a certain logic to it. Germany was a very powerful economically and politically and culturally, but while Germany had been sort of scattered into these microstates, and Europe, you know, France, Spain, and England had gathered the four corners of the world to themselves, Germany had been on the sidelines and failed to acquire the kind of, you know, imperial possessions that now was kind of like the way great nations kept score. So now when Germany is looking at what does Germany have, oh, a couple of protectorates in Africa, and comparing the holdings, you know, obviously of the British Empire and what the French possess abroad, that political reality doesn't reflect the actual relative power and wealth of these nations. And so you have a problem, like I said before, that this new emergent unified German empire in the heartland of Europe is a profoundly disruptive force that the old political framework can't contain.